struggling cowboy agreed to a duel. Not knowing his opponent was his own son, a desperate cowboy agreed to kill a stranger for money. Not knowing the young gun he'd face at dawn was the son he'd abandoned 20 years ago. The coin felt heavier than it had any right to, sitting warm and slick in Caleb Morgan's weathered palm. His last coin. 23 cents between him and the winter that was already whispering through the gaps in his worn-out boots. He stood in the shadow of the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching dust devils dance across Main Street like ghosts of all the choices that had brought him here. Inside the saloon, laughter spilled out like whiskey from an overturned bottle, mixing with the sound of cards slapping against worn wood and the clink of glasses that held more hope than his pockets ever would. Caleb had been standing outside for near an hour now, working up the courage to walk through those swinging doors and spend his last piece of the world on something that might warm him from the inside out. But whiskey wouldn't pay for a room, wouldn't buy him a meal that wasn't shame dressed up as charity, wouldn't give him back the 20 years he'd spent running from a ghost that lived in a grave he'd never visited. The doors swung open, and Samuel Cross stepped into the failing afternoon light like he owned every grain of dust beneath his polished boots. Young, maybe 20, 21. The kind of young that still believed the world owed it something, that still thought a fast draw and a steady hand could solve whatever problems a man might carry. Looking for work, old-timer? The voice cut through Caleb's thoughts like a blade through leather. Samuel's eyes were steel gray, the color of storm clouds gathering over empty prairie. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that made Caleb's chest tighten like a fist around his heart. Depends on the work, Caleb replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The coin grew slick with sweat in his closed palm. Samuel smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Word is, you used to be fast with that iron on your hip. Fast enough to make a living at it. The Colt .45 hung heavy at Caleb's side, his father's gun, passed down through generations of men who'd learned to settle their problems with powder and lead. He hadn't drawn it in anger for more years than he cared to count. Hadn't wanted to. But the weight of it was familiar, comfortable in the way that old sins often were. Used to be a lot of things, Caleb said. Most of them ain't worth remembering. This would be. Samuel stepped closer, and Caleb caught the scent of leather and gun oil, the smell of a man who kept his weapons clean and his conscience cleaner. $500 to the man who can outdraw me tomorrow at noon. Winner takes all. $500. Enough for a horse, supplies, maybe a small spread somewhere far from the ghost that haunted this dusty corner of nowhere. Enough to stop running, to put down roots, to maybe find some peace in whatever years he had left. And if I lose? Caleb asked, though they both knew the answer. Then you won't have to worry about empty pockets anymore. Samuel's hand rested easy on his gun, but fingers steady as stone. You interested, old man? Old man. The words stung worse than they should have, cutting through layers of regret and settled dust to find something tender underneath. Caleb had been called worse things by better men, but something about the way this boy said it, the casual cruelty wrapped in silk, made his jaw clench tight. What's your name, son? Samuel Cross. The boy's chin lifted with pride, like his name was something worth remembering. And you, Caleb Morgan. If the name meant something to Samuel, he didn't show it. Just nodded once, sharp and businesslike, then extended his hand. When Caleb took it, the skin was soft, unmarked by the kind of hard labor that carved lines into a man's palms like a road map of all his failures. Tomorrow then, Mr. Morgan. High noon. Samuel turned and walked back into the saloon, his boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk with the confident rhythm of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. The doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the light and leaving Caleb alone with the gathering darkness and the weight of what he'd just agreed to. He opened his palm and looked down at the coin, still warm from his grip. 23 cents. Tomorrow, it would either be the seed money for a new life or the price he'd paid to buy his way into the ground. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming rain and the distant howl of something wild and lonesome. Caleb pocketed the coin and started walking toward the boarding house, his father's gun heavy against his hip and heavier thoughts weighing down his shoulders. He didn't see Samuel Cross watching him from the saloon window, didn't notice the way the young man's hand trembled slightly as it touched the glass, or the way those steel-gray eyes followed his retreating figure with something that looked almost like recognition flickering in their depths. As Caleb disappeared into the gathering dusk, neither man knew that tomorrow's duel would settle more than just the question of who was faster with a gun. It would settle a debt that had been 20 years in the making, and answer questions that neither was ready to ask. The old cowboy cleaned his father's gun by candlelight, haunted by the wife who died whispering another man's name. While across town, his opponent polished his own weapon, staring at a photograph of the father who never came home. The boarding house room smelled of old tobacco and older regrets. Caleb sat on the edge of his narrow bed, the Colt .45 broken down into its component parts, spread across a faded quilt that had seen better decades. By the light of a single candle, he worked the cleaning rod through the barrel with the kind of practiced rhythm that spoke of years spent trusting his life to the reliability of metal and spring tension. His father's gun, his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Morgan men had carried this weapon, and now it might be the instrument of his own ending. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nothing ever was. Not anymore. Not when the nights stretched long and empty and filled with all the things he'd never said to all the people he'd never see again. The cloth came away clean from the barrel, but Caleb ran it through one more time anyway. In the morning, there could be no doubts, no second chances, no prayers to a God who'd stopped listening to him somewhere around the time he'd decided that running was easier than staying. A memory surfaced like a bubble breaking the surface of still water. Mary, 8 months pregnant and glowing in the lamplight of their little cabin, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she hummed a lullaby to the child that would never know his father's face. She'd been so sure it would be a boy, so certain that their son would grow up strong and proud, that he'd be the kind of man who kept his promises and stayed to see them through. What if I'm not good enough? Caleb had asked her one night, watching shadows dance across the walls while rain drummed against the roof like impatient fingers. What if I can't be the father he needs? Then you'll learn, she'd said, so simple and sure it made his chest ache even now. That's what love does, Caleb. It makes us better than we think we can be. But love hadn't been enough. Not when the bills piled up like autumn leaves, not when the cattle sickened and died, not when every choice seemed to lead to another dead end. Love hadn't kept him from taking that job driving cattle to Kansas, hadn't kept him from the poker game in Dodge City where he'd lost everything they had left. Love hadn't kept him from the shame that ate him alive until running seemed like the only mercy he could offer the woman who deserved better than a husband who couldn't even keep food on their table. By the time he'd worked up the courage to come back, Mary was in the ground and the baby was gone. Sold to his uncle, they'd told him. Given to people who could provide what a father like him never could. Caleb reassembled the gun with hands that barely trembled, muscle memory guiding his fingers through the familiar motions. He never tried to find the boy, never asked his name or where he'd gone. It was better that way, he'd told himself. Cleaner. Some wounds were meant to stay closed. Across town, in a room above the general store, Samuel Cross sat by his own window, staring at a daguerreotype that had gone soft around the edges from too much handling. The woman in the picture was young and beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled even in the stillness of captured silver. She held a baby against her chest, and both of them were smiling like they'd never known the world could be anything but kind. His mother, the only parent he'd ever really known, though she'd died when he was barely old enough to remember the sound of her voice. Uncle Thomas had raised him after that, filled his head with stories about the coward who'd abandoned them, the man who'd run when things got hard and left his family to starve. Your father was a weak man, Uncle Thomas used to say, his voice hard as nails driven into greenwood. Weak men make excuses. Strong men make choices. Remember that, boy. Samuel had remembered. He'd carried those words with him through every fight, every job, every moment when the easy path beckoned like a siren song. He'd made himself fast with a gun because fast men didn't have to run. He'd made himself hard because hard men didn't break when the world pressed down on them like a boot on an anthill. And now, tomorrow, he'd prove it. $500 richer, with one more victory to add to his growing reputation. The old cowboy looked tough enough, whether by sun and wind and whatever disappointments had carved those lines around his eyes, but Samuel had seen the hesitation in his movement, the way his hand had shaken just slightly when they'd shook on the deal. Age always lost to youth in the end. Speed always beat experience when the stakes were life and death. Samuel set the daguerreotype carefully on the small table beside his bed and picked up his own weapon, a newer Colt with a smooth action and a hair trigger that responded to his touch like a lover's whisper. He'd won it off a man in Amarillo who'd been too drunk to know when he was beaten. The previous owner wouldn't be needing it anymore. The gun felt perfect in his hand, balanced and deadly and eager for tomorrow's work. He spun the cylinder, listening to the soft click of metal on metal, then checked each chamber to make sure the bullets were seated properly. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be ready. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending something small and metallic clattering down the empty street. Both men looked up from their preparations, listening to the lonesome sound of the night settling around them like dust on a fresh grave. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what might be the last day of one of their lives. Neither slept well that night, haunted by ghosts they couldn't name and dreams of faces they'd never see again. As dawn crept toward the horizon like a cautious cat, both men lay awake in their separate darknesses, each carrying pieces of the same broken story, neither knowing that tomorrow's bullets would shatter more than flesh. They would shatter the wall of years that had kept a father and son from finding their way home to each other. At high noon, father and son faced each other with loaded guns, 20 paces apart, and in the split second before they fired, the terrible truth shattered both their worlds like breaking glass. High noon in Perdition came with a silence, so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums like cotton soaked in prayer. The sun hung directly overhead, casting short shadows that pooled around boots and hitching posts like spilled ink. Every window along Main Street framed a face. Every doorway held a witness, and the very air seemed to hold its breath. Caleb Morgan stood at the north end of the street, his father's Colt hanging heavy in the worn leather holster that had carried it through 3 generations of hard men and harder choices. 20 paces away, Samuel Cross waited with the patience of youth, his newer weapon gleaming like a promise of violence in the unforgiving light. The wind had died to nothing. Even the dust seemed afraid to move. "You ready, old man?" Samuel called out, his voice carrying clear across the distance between them. There was confidence in his tone, but Caleb caught something else underneath it, something that sounded almost like sadness. "Been ready for 20 years, Caleb replied, and meant it more than he'd expected to. Maybe this was always how it was supposed to end. Maybe some debts could only be paid in blood and gunpowder and the terrible arithmetic of who was faster when the moment came. They began to pace. 10 steps each, slow and measured, their boots hitting the packed dirt in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. The crowd pressed closer to the windows, faces pale and hungry for the kind of violence that would give them stories to tell their grandchildren. 5 steps. 4. 3. Caleb's hand hovered over his gun, but fingers loose and ready. Across from him, Samuel's stance was perfect, textbook, the kind of form that came from hours of practice, and the certainty that practice made perfect and perfect kept you breathing. 2 steps. 1. They turned to face each other, and the world compressed to this single moment, this slice of eternity where 2 men stood ready to solve their problems the way the West had always solved its problems, with lead and luck and the terrible honesty of who wanted to live more. "Draw," someone shouted from the crowd, though later no one could say who. But neither man moved. Something had changed in that final turn, some shift in the light or the angle or the way the shadows fell. Samuel's hat had blown back slightly, revealing the full shape of his face. And for the first time, Caleb saw past the arrogance and the youth to something that made his blood turn to winter in his veins. The eyes. Steel gray, yes, but not just steel gray. They were Mary's eyes, the exact shade and shape, with that same stubborn tilt at the corners when she was thinking hard about something. And the nose, God help him, the nose was pure Morgan, strong and straight and proud as a hawk's beak. But it was the hair that broke him. As the wind picked up and tugged at Samuel's hat, a stubborn cowlick emerged at his left temple, the same impossible swirl that had made Mary laugh every morning when she tried to smooth it down with water and promises. The same cowlick their son had been born with. Time shattered like glass hit with a hammer, 20 years collapsing into a single heartbeat that echoed in Caleb's chest like thunder. He watched his own recognition dawn in Samuel's face, watched those familiar eyes widen as they took in details that had been hidden by shadow and assumption. The scar above Caleb's left eyebrow. Mary had traced it with her finger 1,000 times, asking how he'd gotten it, listening to the story of the horse that had thrown him when he was 12. The way he stood, weight slightly favored on his right leg where an old bullet wound had never quite healed right. The tremor in his left hand that only showed when he was afraid. The same tremor Mary had kissed away on their wedding night. "Papa." The word came out as barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of Main Street, it carried like a gunshot. Samuel's voice cracked on the single syllable, 20 years of anger and abandonment and carefully constructed hatred crumbling like a wall built on sand. Caleb's hand fell away from his gun. His knees wanted to buckle, but he locked them straight through sheer will and the kind of stubborn pride that had kept him alive this long. Samuel, not Samuel Cross, Samuel Morgan, his son, his boy, standing there with death in his hand and tears starting to track down cheeks that looked so much like Mary's, it was like seeing a ghost made flesh. "You left us." Samuel's gun wavered in his grip, the perfect stance dissolving into the shaking hand of a child who'd grown up too fast in too hard a world. "You left us and she died, and I." His voice broke completely, 20 years of carefully buried pain spilling out like blood from a mortal wound. "I know." Caleb took a step forward, then another, his boots loud in the silence. "I know, son. I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." Samuel's gun fell from nerveless fingers, hitting the dirt with a sound like the period at the end of a sentence. He took a shaking step backward, then another, as if proximity to his father might burn him alive. "The money," he said, his voice hollow. "I needed the money to put up a stone for her grave. A proper one, with her name and everything." The words hit Caleb harder than any bullet ever could. His son had been trying to buy dignity for his mother's memory, while his father had been trying to buy his way into another failure. The irony was so sharp it cut him clean through. "She's buried here?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Samuel's face crumbled. "Hill outside town. No marquer. Just." Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture so achingly familiar it made Caleb's chest seize up. "Just dirt and weeds and 20 years of me being too poor to do right by her." The crowd was murmuring now, confused by the turn this had taken, but Caleb didn't care about witnesses anymore. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and pulled his son into his arms, feeling how thin he was under his clothes, how young despite the gun and the reputation and the hard lines that life had carved around his eyes. Samuel fought him for exactly 1 heartbeat before melting into the embrace like a child who'd been lost in the wilderness for 20 years and finally found his way home. He sobbed against his father's shoulder, great racking sounds that came from someplace deeper than grief, deeper than anger, all the way down to the place where love lives even when it's been buried under years of hurt. "I looked for you," Samuel whispered into his father's shirt. "I looked everywhere. I thought maybe you'd come back. Maybe you'd—" "I was afraid," Caleb said simply. "I was a coward, and I was afraid, and I let that fear take me away from everything that mattered, including you." They stood there in the middle of Main Street while the sun beat down, and the crowd slowly dispersed, disappointed by the lack of bloodshed, but somehow moved by something they couldn't quite name. Father and son, holding each other like the world might end if they let go. As the dust settled around them and the truth hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, both men understood that the real duel had never been about who was faster with a gun. It had been about whether love could survive 20 years of absence, and whether forgiveness could grow in ground that had been salted with so much pain. The cowboy who'd abandoned his family 20 years ago knelt in the dirt beside his grown son, and together they made a promise that would finally bring the dead woman they both loved the peace she'd never found in life. The hill outside Perdition rose gentle from the prairie like a sleeping woman's shoulder, crowned with wild grass that bent and whispered in the afternoon breeze. It was a peaceful place, the kind of spot where a soul might find rest if rest was what it was looking for. Mary Morgan lay beneath a simple wooden cross that had weathered to silver, her name carved deep enough to last, but already softening at the edges where 20 winters had worn at the letters. Caleb knelt in the dust beside the grave, his hat in his hands and his head bowed low. Samuel stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, both of them learning how to be in the same space again after so many years of absence. "I used to come here every Sunday," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and remembrance. Told her about everything. My first job, the first time I drew on a man, the first time I killed one. He paused, swallowing hard. Told her about hating you, too. About the things Uncle Thomas said, about how you ran when she needed you most. Caleb's hands tightened on his hat brim, but he didn't speak. There would be time for explanations, for the long conversation that 20 years required, but right now this moment belonged to Mary and the son she'd raised alone and the husband who'd failed her when failure meant everything. "What was she like?" Samuel asked. "I mean, I remember some things, but I was so young. The way she smelled like lavender soap. How she sang when she thought no one was listening. But I never knew. Who was she when it was just the two of you?" Caleb smiled, and for the first time in 20 years it didn't hurt to remember. "She was stubborn as a mule in mud," he said. "Wouldn't back down from anything she believed in. Wouldn't let anyone tell her what was proper for a woman to do or think or say. Smart, too. Smarter than me by half, though she was too kind to mention it most days." He reached out and touched the weathered cross, his fingers tracing the letters of her name. "She used to make these little corn husk dolls for the children in town, give them away every Christmas. Said every child deserved something beautiful to hold, even if it was just corn husks and imagination. And she'd read to me from the newspaper every morning while I drank my coffee, even though I could read just fine myself. Said the words sounded better when they came from someone who cared about whether you understood them." Samuel settled down beside his father in the dust, close enough now that their knees touched. "She made me one of those dolls once. I still have it. You do. Kept it in my saddlebags all these years. Thought maybe it was all I'd ever have of family." Samuel pulled a small, worn figure from his pocket, the corn husks dark with age and handling, but still holding the shape of a child's toy. "Uncle Thomas said it was foolish to carry such things, but I couldn't let it go." Caleb took the doll with hands that shook just slightly, turning it over in his palms like it was made of spun glass and starlight. Mary's work, no doubt about it. He could see her fingers in every twist of husk, every careful knot that held the little figure together. "She made this one special," he said. "See how the arms are positioned? She only did that for the one she made with extra care. This was made for someone she loved." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the grass bend and sway while the sun moved across the sky like it had all the time in the world. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace, and somewhere in the distance a meadow lark called to its mate. "I want to do right by her," Samuel said finally. "The headstone, I mean. Something proper. Something that says who she was, not just when she was born and when she died." "We'll do it together," Caleb said. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. She deserves that much and more." Samuel nodded, then looked at his father with eyes that held a different kind of question. "What happens now? I mean, with us?" It was the question Caleb had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. What had happened when father and son found each other again after 20 years of absence? How did you bridge that kind of gap? How did you learn to be family when you'd never really had the chance to practice? I don't know, he admitted. I can't give you back the years I wasn't here. Can't change the fact that you grew up without me, that you had to become the man you are on your own. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be part of whatever comes next. Samuel was quiet for a long time, staring out at the endless prairie that stretched away toward the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but soft. I used to dream you'd come back. When I was little, I mean. Every night for years I'd dream you'd ride up to Uncle Thomas's place and sweep me up onto your horse, and we'd ride away together. Be cowboys, just the two of us. And now I know it's more complicated than that. Samuel turned to meet his father's eyes, and Caleb saw forgiveness there, tentative but real. But maybe we could start with being men who choose to stay. Men who don't run when things get hard. Caleb reached into his holster and drew out his father's Colt, the gun that had been ready to end his son's life just hours ago. He held it out, grip first, the metal warm from the sun and heavy with history. This belonged to your grandfather, he said, and his father before him. It was supposed to be yours someday, when you were old enough to understand what it meant to carry something like this. Samuel stared at the weapon, but didn't reach for it. I've got my own gun. This isn't about guns, Caleb said gently. It's about family, about the things we pass down and the promises we keep. It's yours by right, son. It always was. Slowly, carefully, Samuel took the Colt from his father's hands. It felt different from his own weapon, older, worn smooth by generations of use, but solid in a way that spoke of reliability and trust. He turned it over, reading the scratches and dings like a map of family history. Thank you, he said simply. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that made the prairie grass glow like it was lit from within. Father and son stood together beside Mary's grave, no longer the strangers who'd faced each other at noon, but not quite sure yet what they were instead. We should head back, Caleb said finally. Talk about that headstone. Maybe find some supper and figure out where we go from here. Samuel nodded, but before they turned to leave, he placed his hand on the weathered cross. We found each other, Mama, he whispered, like you always said we would. The wind picked up, bending the grass, and carrying with it the scent of sage and rain and the endless possibility of tomorrow. As they walked down the hill together, their shadows stretched long behind them, and for the first time in 20 years, neither man was running from anything at all. In the gathering dusk, two men who had almost destroyed each other with violence instead chose the harder path of healing, carrying between them the weight of forgiveness and the promise that some stories, no matter how broken they become, can still find their way to redemption.